From here I'll start talking about the read on the page. This is a very typical situation where we've got your header as the first read, and then possibly a secondary information level, like in a newspaper where you've got a sentence that then brings you a little more information, and the body text itself. This always works. This is pretty standard, but it's not the only way that we can deal with our first, second, and third read going from left to right and top to bottom, large to small. This one takes a lot of liberties in taking our first read, the big, large graphic, and pushing it down below. And then a second read, slightly more complex, still fairly bold area down here. And then pushing our body copy, which is this completely different texture, up here. And it's nice to have this breathing room and these large black solid areas to contrast with these textured areas. It just brings nice variation and complexity to the page. And I was also careful to look at my diagonal lines as opposed to my horizontal lines. The diagonal lines bring action to the page, and the horizontal lines bring stability. So we have lots of stability for reading our body copy. If this was all on an angle, it would be very difficult. But this distracting area here that actually brings our attention to itself, brings us back into our content, and it all makes part of the whole as a big composition. This image here is more to simulate something that might have been done in an older press by overlaying and running through the press several times. But here we've got our biggest element, which is not necessarily the first read, because our contrast was kept nice and low. Our contrast is highest here with something that's actually secondary in size. So we're controlling the first read here with our contrast, and then our third element over here. The actual tools you use to make your type, whether you're using a paintbrush or photography, what effects you use, are not so important as it is to pay attention to how your composition is going together. I showed it with print. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of this on the computer, and this example is maybe using photographic overlays, but the theory is still the same. In this case, I'm using the smallest element to be our first read because it's dead center of our composition, and it's got its highest contrast right there. More important than the technique we're using is actually to come forward with your design first and have something that's real strong. And once you've got that, you can then push maybe some effects in to further exemplify where you want focus to move around on a page. In this case, I brought a little more focus and detail to my little third read so that it made it more interesting, but still supported by my initial design of the entire shape. This image here I brought in because I thought it would be good to talk about getting your type to work with the images it has to work with. In this case, I had an image that had very strong curls and whimsical lines, so it was important to me to bring that type into the world of the image rather than laying it on top. It feels like it belongs there. It feels like it's part of the intended image. And so many times you see an image where the text just feels arbitrary, maybe sitting on top, and it would help to just look at that image and pull something from it that might lend itself to the typography, even if perhaps it's the style of the image and the style of the type, or in this case, the actual shape of the baseline of the type. Again, in this image, I've got these rounded edges, and I kept repeating that. So we've got a first read in here with a very bold round shape, and then pulling in another bold round shape that I could lay in some detail for the last read down here, but giving it a ground to work on, and just the sensibility of that curve working with the sensibility of the curves that maybe are happening in the image, and trying to integrate it as a whole. Here's another image where the typography chosen and the line elements chosen are derivative of some of the lines and things happening in the image. And it's also a good example of balance, because we've got the elements that are jutting out to the right here and elements that are jutting out to the left, balancing each other and making these white spaces feel like they are intentional and giving us areas to breathe and balance out the entire page.
It's like adding an element of physics to it. I notice that a lot in your work, that you think about, you know, as if it were something that really had weight and scale. And I think maybe a lot of people don't make that association, that you can relate it to our perception of physical space and physical relationships.
Yeah, no matter what it is, at least you have something to follow through on. And when the topic comes up or to a client, you can follow through and say, here's where we're going with this design. And a lot of times it doesn't even have to be explained because it becomes apparent that an image has a direction, and it's a strong direction. And another image here, which is similar to our last image, but it's also a good way to talk about tangents again, because you'll notice that right on the apex of the arc, I'm using this line created by the difference between image and non-image. And wherever things are crossing, wherever lines are crossing on this image, are intentional. I'm not letting tangents happen where I don't want them to happen. In this case, the number 3, which to designers may be thought of as the perfect number. So I'm using 3 3s and letting them sort of have symmetrical shapes, and letting those symmetrical shapes balance asymmetrically with the entire thing. So I think of this 3 as kind of the perfect number that maybe needs to be very articulated throughout the image without too many accidental things happening.
I just don't follow what you mean by the 3 being the perfect image. Just taking that shape and saying it's a beautiful shape, or what do you mean?
No, more of the 3 being the number that is used for arrangements of objects in compositions and paintings. 3 being the number of objects used in elements like logos, 3 dots, or 3. You hear it a lot in design, that 3, the number 3, as opposed to having 4. When you end up with 4, you end up with...
It's too symmetrical.
Too symmetrical, or it ends up being either vertical or horizontal.
That's so interesting, because in animation, which I used to teach, when I would show how to do like a cycling, something that would cycle and repeat, I'd always say 3 is the magic number, because if you use 2, it looks too obvious, like it's going, you know, too repetitively. You really see the loop.
Yes.
And with 4, it's almost the same as doing 3, and with 5, it's almost the same as doing 3. So 3 is kind of, you only have to draw it 3 times.
Yep.
And loop it, and it looks irregular, whereas it looks symmetrical or irregular with any other combination. So now I see what you're talking about. That's interesting.
Yeah, you'll see it in Zen, even Japanese flower arranging. The 3 flowers, and one is the mountain and one is the sky, and it dates back. So
interesting.
It recurs.
I've never heard that before.
It even recurs in nature. So
wow.